remove the word midgets from the titles.
Oh, wow.
So it was just called Circus. Okay. And there was one episode where they go give a fan of Ren and Stimpy wins a contest. So they go visit the fan, and the father of this kid is hugely overprotective and sits them down by the fireside and just scares the bejesus out of them. And then George Liqour, of course, who was the character that John Case held on to like grim death, and that character will never die, even though the voice actors passed on. That character is absolutely indefatigable. In fact, it's high time we actually heard from the show's creator, John Kricfalusi. It wouldn't be a Ren and Stimpy podcast without him. And here are his own remembrances of how George Liqour came to be. And he's a character that's been with you for quite some time, right?
Yeah, George Liqour goes back to the same time when I created Ren and Stimpy, about 1980.
Uh-huh.
So he was one of the main characters in the original Ren and Stimpy pitch. And I took the show around all through the 80s to all the networks, to NBC, ABC, CBS, all the Saturday morning cartoon networks. And they all thought it was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I actually got thrown out of NBC one time. They got the security guards. They grabbed me and haul me out of there.
Was George Liqour more of a focus at that point?
Or he was one of the main characters. He was Ren and Stimpy's master.
Uh-huh.
So one of the first stories that I wrote was called Wilderness Adventure. Right. And it was where George Liqour takes his dogs, Ren and Stimpy. George doesn't get cats.
Right.
He just thinks it's a weird, funny-looking dog. So he calls Stimpy, he calls him Rex and Champy. He takes them out to the wilderness. George gets sick of the soft suburban living.
Mm-hmm.
He looks at his gut and he's like, oh, getting soft. I gotta get out and be a man.
Uh-huh.
Run the wilderness and survive. And I'll bring my dogs with me. He loves dogs, right?
Uh-huh.
So he takes them out into the wilderness and they rough it for 5 days. They get lost in the wilderness. So that was one of the first stories, and that was one of the ones I would pitch to everybody. I actually have Bob Jakes and I. Bob Jakes is a great animator from Canada, a friend of mine, one of the main animators on Ren and Stimpy, and his studio, Carbuncle, animated all the best episodes.
Uh-huh.
Anyways, long before we ever actually animated Ren and Stimpy, he and I were just driving through Van Nuys, and we drove by a liquor store. They had this giant neon sign. It said George Liqour, and I screamed, Bob, stop! So Bob screeched to us like, what? And he looks over and it's like, whoa! He starts laughing his ass off, right? And I jumped out and I took a picture of it, and I made Bob drive home to a little apartment I was staying in, and I quickly sketched up this bug-eyed guy with buck teeth and a shotgun out in the middle of the forest, beer cans littered all over the floor, shooting up the whole wilderness. And that was the birth of George Liqour. That was actually the only time I ever instantly thought of a character, knew exactly what he looked like, and knew everything about him. It was just something about that sign. It was a little tiny liquor store and a huge sign. And this guy instantly popped into my head. Just exactly the way he is. I just knew everything about it. It was weird.
I mean, he sort of binds the whole Spumco universe together in a way. He keeps popping up, and he's sort of the main constant, that kind of force of nature that he is.
Well, he's also got a lot of traits that my dad has. He's like the American version of my dad. My dad is a real manly Canadian dad. George is like a manly American dad sort of character. So they have some differences, the same differences that the general Canadian has with the American. I mean, he's from the greatest generation. Mm-hmm. George Liqour was in the big one, the War of 1978 between Canada and the United States. Before they started having wars over oil, they had wars over beer.
Right.
Because Canada has much better beer resources than America does. American beer tastes like piss. Canadian beer is the real thing. That's a man's beer. So George's neighborhood that he lives in is called Decentville. And it's the last decent place in America that isn't corrupted by modern culture. Decentville is right on the border between Canada and the United States. And there's a big fat dotted line, on the map. And there's bushes all around the dotted line, and George is always peering over the bushes, see what those dirty commies are doing in Canada. But really, he just wants to sneak across and buy some Labatt 50, which is the world's most manly beer. You can't even get it in the United States. It's too manly. So George, he was part of the war where the Americans wanted to steal all the Canadian beers.
It's great to have such a huge backstory behind that. Is that sort of help like really solidify when you're doing something with the character and you know so much about his history, it's all kind of worked out?
Well, not with all my characters. Ren and Stimpy don't have much of a backstory.
Uh-huh.
George is a little bit more in the sitcom world than Ren and Stimpy. Ren and Stimpy was sort of half cartoon, half sitcom. George Liqour is maybe, 40% cartoon, 60% sitcom.
Right.
So I wouldn't say he's totally grounded in reality, because obviously we do crazy cartoon jokes that you can't do in real life. I guess because he's human, he has more of a backstory.
Uh-huh.
I don't always use it. I just kind of know it.
Yeah. And they did always work together very well, the episodes with him. And I guess there were only a few in the end where he would be their master, or he would sort of have them, by his side. Always had a great kind of dynamic. Like, he did slot into that world very well.
Well, the funny part is they hated him at Nickelodeon. That was one of the characters. I mean, they loved Ren and Stimpy.
Uh-huh.
And they liked Mr. Horace, but they hated George Liqour. So all through the first season, I was not allowed to do any of the George Liqour cartoons. And we had storyboarded out Wilderness Adventure. Jim Smith did this magnificent, epic storyboard, and they rejected it, which we couldn't figure it out. It was like one of our best storyboards, but they just didn't like the character. I think because he was too manly and too Republican. For some reason, they thought George Liqour was a threat to everything that they held dear. They didn't get the satire of it. George Liqour's a little bit like Archie Bunker in All in the Family, where it's not really condoning Archie's behavior. It's making fun of him.
Do you think maybe they weren't giving a younger audience credit to be able to determine the satirical elements? So I think kids are actually quite astute and they can sort of work that kind of stuff out, but I don't think maybe network people give kids like credit to be able to sort of determine, okay, this is a farcical character and this is a serious character.
They thought he was real. They thought George was real. I think it's because we draw so many of the expressions, and all the expressions are custom made in our cartoons. He seems more real than just an abstract written character. It's hard to explain. But
right.
We made a cartoon called Man's Best Friend, second season. Like, I talked them into using George the second season, because in the first season there were some cartoons that they wanted me to dump that turned out to be the most popular cartoons. And once that happened, I went back to them during the summer between the two seasons. Now that the show's a big hit, can you trust me a little more to do some of the stuff that you were worried about? I mean, you guys rejected Stimpy's Invention over and over again, and it's one of the most popular episodes. So they said, yeah, John, you've proven to us that you know what you're doing. So I said, can I bring back George Liqour then? And they were like, well, okay, I guess so. And the dog show, which they were crazy about, but they aired it. And then we did Man's Best Friend, which was my favorite, and that one, they just freaked out. They couldn't take it, couldn't handle it, even though they approved it at the storyboard stage and the layouts and everything. Once the film came back, it was so intense that they looked at me and they said, well, I couldn't even imagine it was going to be like this. And I said, well, every one of these poses is in the storyboard, but it's not the same thing as, I guess, reading a storyboard. It's seeing the finished film when it has the music, it has the animation,
like the sound effects maybe as well, kind of add to. Or would that have been there in the beginning?
It's the whole experience, right?
Yeah.
And we played with everything. We didn't just write a script and then have the characters stand there and read the voices. We take advantage of every aspect of the cartoon, including the sound. We really worked on sound as much as we worked on the picture. So when you see it all together, it's pretty intense. So they rejected it and they wouldn't run it. It was banned for years and years. And I used to run it at festivals and comic conventions and stuff, movie theaters, and people always went nuts. There's a scene near the end where Ren has a fight with George Liqour, and we did it as sort of an homage to Raging Bull, as a slow motion black and white scene in it and everything, where Ren hits George with an oar. It's animated by Kelly Armstrong. It's it's really good animation, and we played the sound effect of the hit in real slow motion too. We went. You just see his head twist around. We put all these cracking noises in it. When that runs in a movie theater, people stand up in the middle of it and just start screaming. Like, yeah. And kids love it too. So we finally released it on the Ren and Stimpy DVDs. But even there, they hid it. It's like you have to hunt around for it. It's an Easter egg or something. It's hard to find, but it's on there. And it's a very popular episode.
That level of... I mean, violence is the word, but it's with a cartoon that it never gets to the point of, like, you know, it's not like you're putting a kid...
slapstick. It's like Three Stooges violence.
Exactly. And
the funny part is, the parts that the network hated the most are the parts where the audience cheers.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how networks really don't have a connection to the audience. They really don't know what the audience likes, and they keep handicapping the creative people who live to entertain an audience. It's just weird. Yeah. Weird situation.
That was Ren and Stimpy creator John Kricfalusi there on the origins of George Liqour, a character known for the abuse and torment he'd put Ren and Stimpy through, which didn't really make it to TV that much. There was only really one George Liqour episode that actually aired at the time, but the one that was like the